The wind off the English Channel cut like a blade through the concrete bunkers. A young German soldier, Obergefreiter Klaus Meller, 19 years old, from a farming village outside Munich, stood watch in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Below him, the Atlantic stretched grey and infinite, its waves hammering against Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates half submerged in the surf. He pressed his gloved hands against the MG-40 machine gun mounted in the pillbox aperture, the metal cold even through the wool. Somewhere behind him, deeper in the fortification, coffee brewed on a makeshift stove, its bitter aroma mixing with the salt tang of the sea. Meller had been told this Atlantic wall was impregnable. He had been told the Führer himself had ordained it. 15,000 bunkers, 6 million mines, 500,000 obstacles studding the beaches from Norway to Spain. He had been told that, if the Allies came, they would drown in their own blood before they ever touched French soil. What Klaus Meller could not have known, as he stared into that winter darkness, was that across the Channel, in the shipyards of Britain and the drawing rooms of Allied command, engineers were already dismantling the very assumption upon which the Atlantic Wall had been built. They were not planning to assault a port. They were planning to bring the port with them. The Atlantic Wall was born from trauma. After the catastrophic raid on Dieppe in August 1942, where Canadian and British forces were slaughtered on the beaches, over 3,000 casualties in 9 hours, Adolf Hitler became convinced that the fortress coastline was the Reich's salvation. If the Allies could be stopped at the water's edge, Germany would never have to fight a two-front war on land. The Dieppe raid had proven what Hitler believed, that modern ports, with their cranes and jetties, were death traps, easily defended. The Allies had learned the same lesson, but they drew a different conclusion. If capturing a port was suicide, then they simply would not capture one. The man who would unravel Hitler's coastal fortress was not a general, but a logistics officer with the mind of a shipbuilder. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, posed a question in the autumn of 1942 that seemed absurd on its face. If the Germans held every port, why not build artificial harbours and tow them across the English Channel? The idea was presented to Winston Churchill during a meeting at 10 Downing Street. Churchill, who had been a naval officer before he was a politician, did not laugh. Instead, he scribbled a note that would change the course of the war. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. What emerged from that directive was a project so audacious that even those building it struggled to believe it would work. The Allies would construct to complete artificial harbours codenamed Mulberry A and Mulberry B, each the size of Dover's port. They would be towed across 100 miles of open ocean and assembled off the invasion beaches within days of the landing. Each harbour would consist of floating roadways, massive concrete caissons weighing 6,000 tons apiece, sunken, block ships to form breakwaters, and floating pierheads that rose and fell with the 20-foot Norman tide. Together, they would be capable of unloading 12,000 tons of supplies and 20,000 men per day. The Atlantic Wall, with all its guns and mines, had been designed to repel an amphibious assault. It had not been designed to face an enemy who could turn the open sea into a functioning logistics hub. The German High Command knew the invasion was coming. Intelligence reports throughout the spring of 1944 made that clear. What they did not know was where. General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of Army Group B in late 1943, inspected the coastal defences obsessively. He drove the length of the French coast, from Brittany to Calais, ordering additional minefields, more concrete, deeper obstacles. Rommel had fought the British in North Africa. He knew their capabilities, their stubbornness, their industrial might. But even Rommel, for all his tactical brilliance, could not conceive of what was being assembled in the ports and inlets of southern England. The Mulberry Harbors were beyond the vocabulary of conventional warfare. They represented not just engineering, ingenuity, but a fundamental reimagining of amphibious operations. By May 1944, over 20,000 British workers laboured in secrecy to construct the components of the Mulberry Harbors. The concrete caissons called Phoenix units were built in dry docks along the Thames and in coastal yards from Southampton to Scotland. Each caisson was as tall as a 5-story building. Some were equipped with anti-aircraft guns. Others contained quarters for the men who would crew them during the crossing. The roadway's co-denimed whale units consisted of steel spans resting on floating pontoons, flexible enough to ride the swell of the channel, but strong enough to support 30-ton tanks. To protect the harbours from storm waves, the Allies planned to sink dozens of obsolete ships in a line offshore, forming a barrier called Gooseberry. And to extend the breakwater further, they designed massive cruciform steel floats called bombardants, each weighing 200 tons, which would bob on the surface and dissipate wave energy. The scale of the deception required to hide this construction was almost as impressive as the engineering itself. German reconnaissance aircraft occasionally photographed the Thames estuary and the southern coast, but Allied intelligence fed the Wehrmacht narrative. These were simply repairs to existing docks, routine maintenance of Britain's battered infrastructure. The truth that Britain was building portable harbours was so far outside German strategic assumptions that even when they saw photographic evidence, they misinterpreted it. In the zero-sum calculus of fortress Europe, ports were fixed positions to be defended. The idea that ports could be mobile, disposable, assembled and disassembled like a child's toy, did not fit within the doctrinal framework of the German General Staff. Klaus Meller and the tens of thousands of soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall were not fools. They were professionals, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, men who understood fieldcraft and killing. But they had been fed a certainty that the English Channel itself was Germany's greatest ally. The Channel was treacherous, storm-prone, its tides violent. No army could sustain a major offensive without a port, and every major port from Cherbourg to Antwerp was a fortress. Meller had walked through the bunkers of Weiderstansnes 62, his position overlooking Omaha Beach. He had seen the interlocking fields of fire, the machine gun nests positioned to enfilade the sand, the mortar pre-sighted on the waterline. He had been told that even if the Allies landed, they would have days, perhaps a week, before they ran out of ammunition, fuel, and food. Then the panzers would arrive, and the invaders would be crushed against the sea. What Meller did not know, what none of them knew, was that the Allies had solved the logistics equation before the first landing craft touched sand. The night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, the components of the Mulberry Harbors began their journey. Under cover of darkness and foul weather, tugs hauled the massive Phoenix caissons out of their anchorages and into the channel. The crossing was a nightmare of seamanship. Waves 20 feet high battered the concrete structures. Tow cables snapped. Some caissons listed dangerously, taking on water. Crews worked through the night with pumps and welding torches, fighting to keep the ungainly structures afloat. At the same time, the old merchant ships and obsolete warships designated for the Gooseberry breakwaters steamed toward France under skeleton crews, each vessel loaded with scuttling charges, waiting for the signal to open their seacocks and settle onto the seabed. When dawn broke on June 6th, and the first waves of infantry stormed the beaches, the men of the Atlantic Wall fought with everything they had. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter was immense. American soldiers drowned in the surf, weighed down by equipment, cut apart by machine gun fire. For a few terrible hours, it seemed as though Hitler's prophecy had come true, that the Atlantic Wall would hold. But the Allies were not relying on the infantry alone. Offshore, just beyond the range of German artillery, the vanguard of the Mulberry Harbors waited. Within 24 hours of the landing, the first block ships were scuttled off Arromanches and St. Lawrence-sur-Mer, forming the skeleton of the breakwaters. Within 72 hours, the first Phoenix caissons were towed into position and sunk. Within a week, the floating roadways were being assembled, pontoon by pontoon, extending from deep water to the beach. German officers, watching from the cliffs, could not understand what they were seeing. In the intelligence reports filed to Rommel's headquarters, there is confusion, disbelief. One officer described a floating city appearing offshore. Another reported that the Allies were constructing harbour installations in the open sea. The reports were forwarded up the chain of command. But by then it was too late. The Atlantic wall had been bypassed, not by force of arms alone, but by an act of logistical imagination so bold that the German High Command had never thought to defend against it. By June 12th, the Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches, designated Mulberry B, was operational. British trucks rolled down the floating roadways, their wheels humming on the steel spans, crossing from Liberty ships anchored in deep water directly onto French soil. Fuel bowsers, ammunition trucks, artillery pieces, whole battalions of infantry, they flowed ashore in a river of men and material that never stopped. The harbour could unload 7,000 tons per day. The Allies had planned for it to last 3 months. It would end up serving 410, delivering over 2.5 million tons of supplies. Mulberry, the American harbour off Omaha Beach, was less fortunate. On June 19th, a massive storm, the worst June gale in 40 years, roared out of the North Atlantic. For 3 days, waves battered the Norman coast. The American Mulberry, less sheltered than its British counterpart, was torn apart. Pontoons broke free, caissons cracked, the floating roadways buckled and sank. When the storm cleared, Mulberry was a wreck, irreparable. But even in destruction, the artificial harbours had served their purpose. By the time the storm hit, over 300,000 men and 50,000 vehicles had already come ashore. The beachhead was secure. The German counteroffensive, which Rommel had hoped to launch before the Allies could consolidate, never came. There was no window of vulnerability. The Mulberry Harbors had closed it. Klaus Meller survived D-Day. He was captured on June 8th during the fighting inland from Omaha Beach, taken prisoner along with what remained of his company. In the weeks that followed, as he was processed through a POW camp in England, he saw for himself the scale of what had defeated him. British guards marched the prisoners past warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with rations, ammunition, medical supplies. They saw fields filled with tanks, endless rows of them, painted in olive drab, waiting to be shipped to France. One evening, sitting in the mess hall of the camp, Meller was given dinner, white bread, canned beef, vegetables, and coffee with sugar. It was more food than he had seen in a single meal in 2 years. He later told an interviewer, decades after the war, that this was the moment he understood the Atlantic Wall had been a fantasy. Germany had been fighting an enemy that could build ports in the ocean. What chance had concrete and barbed wire ever had? The psychological impact of the Mulberry Harbors extended beyond the immediate battlefield. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Atlantic Wall had been more than a defensive position. It had been a symbol of German invincibility, a manifestation of the Führer's will. When that wall was bypassed, when the Allies simply brought their own ports and rendered Germany's fortifications irrelevant, it shattered a fundamental belief. The logic of Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, had always rested on the assumption that Germany could dictate the terms of engagement, could force the Allies to assault prepared defences, could trade space for time. The Mulberry Harbors inverted that logic. The Allies had refused to play the game Germany had prepared for. They had rewritten the rules. Rommel recognized this almost immediately. In a letter to his wife dated June 11th, he wrote, "The enemy's resources are so vast that they can afford to waste what would be, for us, irreplaceable. They do not simply have more men and more guns. They have more imagination." It was an extraordinary admission from a man who had built his reputation on daring and improvisation. But Rommel understood that the Mulberry Harbors represented something deeper than engineering prowess. They represented a society that could mobilize not just soldiers, but shipwrights, steelworkers, mathematicians, and visionaries. They represented an enemy that saw obstacles not as walls, but as problems to be solved. the recurring symbol of the Mulberry Harbors, the image that burned itself into the memory of every soldier who saw them, was the roadway. That long, steel ribbon stretching from ship to shore, rising and falling with the tide, but never breaking. German soldiers standing on the cliffs above Arromanches watched trucks drive across the sea. It seemed impossible, a violation of the natural order. The channel, which had been their moat, their shield, had been tamed. The roadway became a metaphor for allied industrial power, flexible, relentless, indifferent to obstacles. Where the Atlantic wall was rigid concrete and rebar, fixed in place, immovable, the Mulberry roadways were fluid, adapting to wind and wave, bending but never breaking. It was as if the Allies had made the ocean itself into an ally. The construction of the Mulberry Harbors had required the labor of over 45,000 workers. It had consumed 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 floating pierheads, 200 phoenix caissons, and 23 old ships for the breakwaters. The cost in monetary terms over £40 million. A staggering sum in 1944 was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what the harbors enabled. The sustained logistical flow that turned a beachhead into a front, and the front into a campaign of liberation. By August, Allied forces were breaking out of Normandy. By September, they were at the German border. The Atlantic Wall, which had taken 3 years and billions of Reichsmarks to construct, had been rendered obsolete in a matter of weeks, dotting the bunkers that remained. Abandoned now, the coffee cups still sat on makeshift tables. Graffiti scratched into the concrete walls recorded the names of soldiers from Hamburg, Berlin, Vienna, men who had believed, because they had been told, that the wall would hold. After the war, French villagers explored these ruins. They found letters never sent, photographs of girlfriends and wives, playing cards laid out in unfinished games. In one bunker overlooking Gold Beach, someone had carved into the wall a line from a folk song, Die Gedanken sind frei, thoughts are free. It was unclear whether the soldier had meant it as defiance or despair. The story of the Mulberry Harbors is often remembered as a triumph of engineering, and it was. But it was also a triumph of a different kind of thinking. The German General Staff, for all its tactical sophistication, was trapped in a paradigm. They saw war as a contest of fortification and maneuver, of fixed positions and armored breakthroughs. The Allies, by contrast, saw war as a problem of logistics and adaptation. The question was not how to break through the Atlantic Wall, but how to make the Atlantic Wall irrelevant. This required not just resources, though. Resources mattered, but a willingness to imagine solutions that had never existed before. Churchill's offhand comment, "You don't argue the matter," contained a profound insight. In total war, the side that can afford to attempt the impossible and fail and try again has an advantage that no amount of concrete can overcome. The Mulberry Harbors were not perfect. Mulberry was destroyed. Even Mulberry required constant repair, as storms and tides battered the pontoons and caissons. But it did not matter. The Allies could afford imperfection. They could afford redundancy. They had built the harbors knowing that one might fail. They had stockpiled spare parts, trained salvage crews, prepared for contingencies. The Atlantic Wall, by contrast, could afford no imperfection. It had to hold, completely, or it was worthless. There is a photograph, taken in late June 1944, that captures the essence of this disparity. It shows the Arromanches Mulberry Harbor in full operation. In the foreground, a British soldier stands on the floating roadway, smoking a cigarette, watching a convoy of trucks roll past. In the background, stretching to the horizon, are the masts of ships, dozens of them, cargo vessels and tankers, waiting their turn to unload. The soldier's posture is casual, almost bored. This, the photograph suggests, is routine. This is simply what Britain and America do. They turn the ocean into a highway. Somewhere inland, beyond the frame of the photograph, the remnants of the Atlantic Wall still stand, but they have become scenery, relics, as irrelevant as medieval castle walls in the age of artillery. The engineers who designed the Mulberry Harbors were not celebrated in the way that generals and admirals were. Their names Hugh Iris Hughes, who designed the Whale roadways, Guy Maunsell, who pioneered the Phoenix caissons, are largely forgotten outside specialist histories, but their work embodied a principle that would define the Allied victory. That wars are won not just by the courage of soldiers, but by the ingenuity of those who supply them. The Atlantic Wall was a monument to the idea that war could be won through defensive superiority, through making the cost of attack unbearable. The Mulberry Harbors were a rebuttal. They proved that no defense is absolute, that creativity and resources can overcome any obstacle, that the true strength of a democracy, not in its walls, but in its capacity to solve problems collectively. In the years after the war, as Europe rebuilt, the remnants of the Mulberry Harbors remained. The Phoenix caissons, too heavy to remove, were left in place off Arromanches. Over time, they became an artificial reef, colonized by barnacles and seaweed, home to fish and crabs. French fishermen learned to navigate around them. Tourists visiting the D-Day beaches could see them at low tide, massive concrete blocks rising from the sand, inscribed with faded military markings. They became monuments not to victory in battle, but to the victory of imagination over dogma. Klaus Meller, the young soldier who had stood watch on January 17, 1944, believing the war would hold, returned to Germany after the war. He became a schoolteacher in Bavaria, teaching history to children born after the war had ended. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he was asked what he remembered most about the invasion. He did not talk about the gunfire, or the bombing, or the terror of combat. He talked about the roadway. He talked about standing in a prison camp in southern England, looking out through barbed wire at the preparations for the next wave of landings, and seeing trucks being loaded with supplies, mountains of supplies, crates stacked 20 feet high, and understanding that Germany had never had a chance. We were taught that we could overcome material, he said, that discipline and belief were stronger than factories and ships. The Mulberry Harbors showed us the lie. You cannot will a harbor into existence. You cannot believe your way across the channel. You have to build it. The Atlantic Wall still stands in fragments along the coast of France. Some of the bunkers have been turned into museums. Others are slowly being swallowed by sand and vegetation, reclaimed by the landscape. On winter mornings, when the wind off the channel is sharp and cold, you can stand in those bunkers and imagine what Klaus Meller saw: the grey sea, the distant horizon, the certainty that the enemy could never come. But if you walk down to the beach at Arromanches at low tide, you can see something else: the barnacle-encrusted caissons of Mulberry Bay, still there after 80 years, indestructible not because they were designed to last forever, but because they were designed to do their job and then be forgotten. The lesson of the Mulberry Harbors is not simply that the Allies had more resources than Germany, though they did. It is that they were willing to use those resources in ways that defied conventional wisdom. The Atlantic Wall was built on the assumption that the enemy would do what was expected, that they would conform to the logic of fortress warfare. The Mulberry Harbors succeeded because they refused that logic. They asked a different question: not how do we break through, but how do we go around; not how do we capture a port, but how do we make a port unnecessary. This was the essence of democratic warfare in the 20th century, not the imposition of a single vision from above, but the aggregation of countless small innovations from below. The Mulberry Harbors were designed by committees, built by civilian contractors, tested by trial and error. They were imperfect, expensive, and sometimes they failed, but they were also adaptable, scalable, and ultimately unstoppable. They represented a form of power that totalitarian regimes, for all their discipline and fervor, could never replicate: the power of a free people to argue, experiment, fail, and try again. In the end, the Atlantic Wall was defeated not by heroism, though there was heroism, but by arithmetic. The Mulberry Harbors could land more men and supplies in a day than the Germans could move by rail in a week. They turned the channel from a barrier into a conveyor belt. They made the impossible routine, and in doing so, they revealed the central truth of the Second World War, that freedom, messy and inefficient as it may be, is also relentless. It does not build walls to hide behind. It builds roads, across oceans if necessary, and it keeps moving forward. On a cold morning in January, 80 years after Klaus Meller stood watch over the Atlantic, the concrete caissons still rise from the sand at Aramanches. The roadways are gone, the pontoons scrapped long ago, but the principle remains. Walls can be bypassed, fortresses can be made irrelevant, and the greatest defense of all is not concrete or steel, but the willingness to imagine a world that does not yet exist, and then build it one floating roadway, one steel span, one impossible harbor at a time,